Police in France are still investigating that terrible series of attacks in Paris Friday, and while investigators in Egypt are working on several theories about what happened aboard that Russian Metrojet flight 9258. The latest working theory there is that an ally of ISIS in Egypt was responsible. To discuss all of this further, we welcome former pilot Albert Goldson from Indo-Brazilian Associates, and Professor Bill Rosenberg is back. He's from Drexel University. And live via Skype is Patrick Smith from Massachusetts. He is a pilot and an author as well. Gentlemen, welcome. I notice we have no women on the show today. I guess it's just the guys here.
Yes, Next week it'll be all women.
Okay, let's discuss this situation first in France. They're talking about maybe it was tied into some of the refugees who came from the Middle East. Your reaction first, right off the bat.
Well, first of all, I think you got to be very careful because it's really easy to taint all these immigrants as being part of this, when so far there's really no evidence. In fact, this morning, when I was before I came up, there was an article that said something like they found a Syrian passport on the ground, okay, which has no bearing on whether or not it had anything to do with a Syrian. I think we have to recognize that there are probably two situations which could potentially be linked, but we don't really know right now, and I think we have to be careful not to jump.
Of course.
I think what we're really facing is basically France's 9/11. Okay, they suffered a huge blow, and really the whole idea about terrorism is striking fear in the hearts and minds of people, and this certainly did it not only for France but also for Germany and the United States.
Ms. Goldson.
What's disturbing is that there were 6 almost simultaneous attacks, which requires practically military precision.
Yes.
So whichever individuals pulled off this horrific act certainly had advanced training and experience to be able to plan well in advance and to be able to make these attacks. Also, at the same time, you have a number of key events that are coming up in the very near future. I believe the climate conference that will be taking place in a couple of weeks, and you have the G20 that's also taking place, and not to mention some other events that are taking place in Europe. For example, OPEC will be meeting on December 4th. So the timing of these attacks is certainly disturbing, as well as how well it was organized.
All right, Mr. Smith, we're going to talk about the plane down in the Sinai in just a bit, but just discussing this subject as we take it further. The reaction from France that now we're in a state of war. What was your reaction to that?
Well, just remember that one of the goals of terrorism is to encourage an overreaction. And so whatever happens next, it's important that the response be rational and be measured and not play into the hands of terrorists who do want the response to be over the top and irrational. In some ways, that's what we saw after 9/11 here in the U.S. And my feeling is that the Europeans are less prone to panic and overreaction than we Americans are, but we'll see.
Professor Rosenberg, when I heard this story yesterday, I said to myself, is any great city in Europe now safe? I mean, you really can't stop something.
Well, there's really no safe city anywhere in the world, but that's because of our fear of terrorism.
Right.
What I think we also have to recognize, though, is that ISIS, in some ways, is making a strategic positive decision for themselves and also negative. Positive in the sense that they've demonstrated they were able to carry out this big attack, which means that a lot of jihadist types are going to want to jump on the bandwagon and be with the side that appears to be winning. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why they're taking credit for it. The negative is, just like we've heard, there's going to be several international conferences with world leaders from all over the political spectrum and geography that are all going to come together in the same room. And ISIS has to be a little bit concerned that all of a sudden all these world leaders don't decide to band together and go after them. And I think that's the yin and the yang of all this.
You bring up a very good point, because after hearing about this, I said, look, if all the nations did get together in the world and contributed soldiers and so on, they could probably wipe these guys out sooner or later just by sheer numbers against numbers. Why hasn't that happened so far?
Well, each country has had their own particular political agenda, and of course they have to follow the domestic constituency,
but
for example.
All would agree that this has to be stopped, wouldn't they?
Well, this gives them a perfect incentive to do so, and they can pool their resources together. The European countries, well, particularly France, since they were a direct victim of this attack, the United States, which also has a presence there, and also Russia, who also has a presence in the Middle East. The question is to come together with a cohesive strategic plan to be able to to take out ISIS once and for all.
We understand these are very bad people, but again, by sheer numbers, there has to be, what, 50,000 of them? 30,
Well, the argument that's been voiced prior to this past couple of months is that if Turkey wanted to take them out, Turkey alone could do it.
Yeah.
The bottom line is, though, that as been stated, the constituencies within these countries may not be there because today the United States wasn't attacked, France was. And if you go back just a few years ago, and if we go back a few of these programs ago, the issue came up about Barack Obama drawing the line in the sand in Syria. And what happened was, when he drew the line and Assad crossed it, there was nobody behind him. There wasn't anybody in the United States except Lindsey Graham and John McCain, and the rest of the world community wasn't behind it. So you have to be careful that you, again, do a rational strategy. But I think ISIS has made a terrible mistake because what they've done now is they've given the opportunity for all of these nations which have different agendas to be able to potentially see a clear path.
And by coincidence, meeting in the next week and then the following week
Sure.
after that at the Paris conference as well.
Let's
Let's talk to Mr. Smith for a moment. Where is the United Nations here? Of course, they condemn this, and they usually do, and obviously for justifiable reasons. But why isn't the United Nations discussing this and saying this has to stop?
You can make the argument that a coalition could go in and take ISIS out in a matter of hours, given enough manpower and firepower. But the real issue here is consider that done, you still have essentially three failed states, Iraq, Syria, and now Libya. And until those countries are stabilized and until there's a legitimate government in place, an effective government in each of those countries, that void is almost inevitably going to be filled by some form of extremism. And so taking out ISIS today doesn't solve the problem long term. I think you would have another faction, another group of groups, and it would just go on and on.
Now, I made this point to somebody the other day while I was discussing this. Saddam Hussein, we agree, was a terrible dictator, one of many dictators in the world who were awful. But it seemed as though he was the plug that kept everything in place. And when Iraq fell, all these other groups were able to emerge and bubble up. It seems to me in retrospect, and not been political because I'm not, but in retrospect, maybe keeping Saddam Hussein, as terrible as he was, we all agree, in place, might have prevented all of this mayhem.
Well, that it's an argument that gets voiced. The same thing has been said about Muammar Gaddafi. The same thing is being said right now about Assad. The question is, ultimately, what is in the best national interests of each of these individual countries, United States, Great Britain, France, and so forth, both from a security standpoint at home, but also from a world leadership standpoint. And sometimes those are not going to be in sync, and that's where the dilemma comes. When a leader has to make a decision, are they going to go on their own, okay, or are they going to want to have a coalition, or are they going to want to have the massive public support behind the country?
Which so far we don't have.
Which we don't have. We did have more support, if you look back over the last probably 4 or 5 months, for an agreement that, yes, Obama should be aiding the Iraqi government in terms of assaults against ISIS in Iraq. Not so much in Syria because the Syrian strategy hadn't worked. Training 50 soldiers who really couldn't defend themselves for tens of millions of dollars was a strategy that failed.
Let's discuss Vladimir Putin's involvement in the region and whether or not, in your estimation, that had something to do, and we still don't know what happened with that Russian aircraft, but maybe that had something to do with it. You're a pilot, you've seen some of the data on that. What is your take on the downing of that jet?
Well, the interesting thing about what Putin has been doing is when a plane crashes in a particular territory, for example, it was Egypt,
Right.
that country has the jurisdiction.
Right.
They assign the Russians to be the lead investigating team. And it wasn't until a couple of days ago that they invited the FBI and the National Transportation Safety Board to come aboard and to take a look at what happened. Now, initially, Russia denied that it could have been a terrorist attack, but then he reversed himself and said, well, it probably is one. Now, this politically plays in very well because by working with the FBI and other U.S. agencies, he gives at least the perception that he is part of a coalition that is battling terrorism in the Middle East and elsewhere. So that gives him a certain level of credibility whether he has any genuine intention about that or not. Also, to get Russia into the world community fighting terrorism, and at the same time, in the actually short term, to see if the West will lift sanctions with Russia that are scheduled to expire in January.
It distracts against Ukraine as well.
Exactly. And it's always a complicated situation. Let's go to Patrick Smith. Patrick Smith, you've seen some of the data on the downing of that Russian jet. What does it say to you?
It seems to be pretty clear, based on a lot of information that we're not privy to, that it was a bomb. And so the question is, how did it get on the airplane? Who put it there? And what are the ramifications from that point for airport security, passenger safety, and so forth?
Well, does, again, you've seen all the information. You're a pilot as well, and you know how it technically works there. Satellite saw a flash from space. Does that mean that it could have been something that happened minus a bomb, some sort of mechanical problem?
Conceivably. I mean, that option is still on the table, but I think there's a lot about this we're just not being told, and I think it will eventually be laid out there that this was a bomb. And a couple of things about that concern me. First is how we react. Now, remember that commercial aviation has always been a prime target for sabotage and for politically motivated sabotage. And bombings and hijackings didn't start with September 11th. Go back to the 1970s and the 1980s, Pan Am 103 and UTA and Air India. Bombings, in fact, were much more common in those days than they are nowadays. So we need that sense of perspective, which will help us gauge how to react. And then you have the airport security aspects, and I'm a little nervous about the way things are trending, especially in this country where so much of our airport security apparatus is really theatrical more than legitimately effective. And I don't want to see yet more layers of irrational, tedious security measures put on top of what we already have. And I think it's important for people to realize that short of turning our airports into fortresses, we're never going to make ourselves completely safe. And the real job of keeping terrorists away from planes, it doesn't belong to the screeners on the concourse. It's the job of law enforcement, of the FBI and CIA and these other entities working backstage, behind the scenes.
Let me hold you right there.
Stop terrorists before they get to the airport.
Patrick Smith, let me hold you up right there. Let's get back to the panel here for just a moment. I have a question, but you...
Yeah, no, one of the things I wanted to say is you also have to recognize, just like in an earlier segment today, is that the world community is working together. You know, as it comes out, it gets leaked out that Israel was actually the one who identified that it was probably a bomb and had evidence that they shared with the United States and Great Britain. Russia said there was no bomb. Then Russia got presented with the evidence. And now, if you think about it, the U.S., Israel, Great Britain, and Russia are all basically working as a team together. And I think that's a pretty good message that says ISIS has to be careful, because if they poke the bear in the eye too much, there's consequences.
Well, let's speculate, because there's no confirmation, but let's speculate and say a bomb did indeed take down that plane. What does that say to the Russians who just recently got involved in the region by building bases in Syria? Are they on notice now?
They didn't really build a base in Syria. The base that we're talking about is actually a naval base that's been there since 1971.
All right, use the base.
Okay.
We only have a couple of minutes.
Okay. So the point is that Russia very much wants to maintain that base. Russia wants to make sure whoever the succession is to Assad is also going to let them be there. The difference is now they're projecting power within the country rather than using the base to project it with the rest of the world. So I think we have to be careful, but we have to recognize that Russia's going to have certain issues. I think the point that you made a few moments ago, that they want to be part of the world community so they can distract from things like Ukraine. They're part of the team that's working together, not the problem.
All right, we're going to give you the last word. What does your gut tell you about this particular incident? You think it is a bomb, or was a bomb?
I believe it was a bomb. One of the telling factors is that they did not allow the Russians did not release autopsy results of the passengers, which would tell by either burn marks or what types of fumes they inhaled whether it was a bomb or not. And those results have not been released whatsoever, because all the passengers were Russians and they've all been sent back to Russia. So we don't, that one piece of evidence, critical evidence, forensic evidence, we don't have.
All right, we've run out of time. We want to thank Patrick Smith for joining us via Skype today. And gentlemen, thank you as well. Good discussion. When we come back, the always popular lightning round, when we get set to look at some of the issues of maybe not so much important this week, but fun things. We'll be back in just a moment.